You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Ancient tools and burials, plants and seeds, Neanderthals.
Welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast, episode 92. I'm your host, Sarah Head, and I'm joined today with my co-host, Ken Fader. Today we're interviewing Dr. Jennifer Raff, a geneticist who studies ancient DNA. Jennifer is a returning champion to the show. We've had her on before to discuss Haplogroup X and how that relates to the Solutrean Hypothesis. Since the CBC show, The Nature of Things, has put out an episode titled The Ice Bridge, which again brings up the Solutrean Hypothesis, we've decided to bring Jennifer back on the show and to have her discuss with us what we thought of the most recent episode of The Nature of Things. Get ready to think critically.
Trench, monuments, going to the pub when the day is spent.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the Archaeological Fantasies Podcast. I am your host, Sarah Head, and I am joined today by my co-host, Ken Fader. How's it going, Ken?
It's going. I don't know how well it's going, but it is going every day. So, classes we're a couple of weeks into the semester, and students aren't yet asking if the final is cumulative, so I'm good.
Well, that's always a good sign.
That's a good sign, right?
My own classes are going along well, so no major meltdowns yet. Give it another
Excellent.
2 weeks. But today we have a special guest with us, Jennifer Raff, who is a returning champion to the show. We've had Jennifer on before to discuss her works with genetics, with ancient genetics, and specifically with the Haplogroup X line.
Haplogroup X, yeah.
Thank you, Haplogroup X. And Jennifer is joining us again today because we are going to talk about the most recent documentary that Jennifer was on. Would you like to introduce your documentary, Jennifer?
Well, I wouldn't call it my documentary, but thanks for
you were on it.
You don't want to take credit for it, do you, Jen? Huh?
Well, they didn't end up going with any of my suggestions for the documentary, so I'm not going to take credit for this one.
So you had creative differences with the director?
Well, let's just say that she asked me a lot of questions about sort of the background, and I gave her my take. And
before we even get into that,
I was going to say we're burying the lead a bit here. So
let's remind people that I think the last time Jennifer was on, we talked about genetics of the first Americans as it related to the Solutrean Hypothesis. This notion that the consensus among archaeologists for decades now is that the population of Northeast Asians, those are the folks who managed to get across the Bering Land Bridge, interior, along the coast, that those were the first Americans. That the origin, the source of a human population in the New World is Northeast Asia. And by the way, that's something that a Spanish cleric in the early 17th century, Acosta, suggested. So that's an old idea, and it's an idea where the data, the evidence shows very clearly that that's what happened. However, and I'm not sure it goes back 100 years, but at least I remember as a graduate student in the 1970s reading an article from Current Anthropology that dated to 1963 by Greenman, which was all about this alternative hypothesis that maybe, in fact, either most Native Americans were descendant of Europeans, or at least there was a secondary movement of people, not just from Asia, but from Europe, across an ice bridge or across a narrowed Atlantic because of sea level decline, and that those folks also contributed to the population of folks in the New World aboriginally, and specifically the Solutrean people who are making these beautiful bifacially flaked spear points, people painting in caves in France and in Spain. And so that's an old idea that's been resurrected by a couple of archaeologists, very well-known and highly regarded archaeologists. Bruce Bradley, who is one of the premier lithic analysts and experimental archaeologists, and Dennis Stanford, who's an archaeologist at the Smithsonian. And these folks, it's got to be sometime in the 90s when they sort of resurrected this notion that there's new evidence now to support this old idea. And so we've had Jennifer on the show once before, talking about whatever genetic evidence tells us about the source of Native American population. And now there's this new show, produced in Canada, which is very supportive of this hypothesis. Now, Jennifer, how did you get involved? How did they contact you?
Well, before we do that, the show itself is put out by the CBC, which is the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Okay, so the name of the show is called The Nature of Things, and the particular episode that we're talking about is titled The Ice Bridge, and this harkens back to what Ken mentioned about this supposed ice shelf that stretched from Spain, Portugal area, all the way across to, where were they connecting it at exactly? It was like
northeastern
Maine
Canada.
Area? Yeah, Canada and the Maine.
New England, Canada.
Yeah, and it's
uncertain.
Yeah, and it's a really long distance. Even in the show, they mention how long of a distance that was, and it's not a believable distance to travel. If you get to watch the show, you'll see these claims being made. And as Ken was saying, we've had Jennifer on, and Jennifer, you were on the show. You were one of the consultants for the show, and you were telling us before we got started about your experience being a consultant for this show. Can you retell some of that for us?
Sure. I had a largely a good experience with them. I thought the director was very nice, and we had a lot of really great discussions. We really got into the weeds about genetics. I mean, I was telling her about F statistics and genomes and all this stuff. Like we went into excruciating detail.
Mm-hmm.
I found her many archaeologists to talk about why the Solutrean hypothesis was not a viable explanation. But in the end, I guess they had a particular perspective that they wanted to portray, which was the story of Stanford and Bradley and Oppenheimer, the geneticists that they had on there. And they went with that story, and then the rest of us were, the dissenters. And
right.
It was a directorial choice, and that's fine. But I am kind of disappointed that they decided to go that way, given how I thought I had done an okay job persuading her, or showing her how much the evidence was weighted against that. But in the end, they went with the story they were going to tell. So
right. Well, I think that's kind of universally the case. Well, almost universally the case on these even science documentaries produced by really good organizations, is that their primary concern is telling a compelling story. And if you've got two maverick archaeologists who are fighting the man, fighting the consensus, the conservative consensus, that's a compelling story. If you can say in that show, they have come up with evidence that throws everything we know, you throw that out the window, there's a completely new model. That's exciting and compelling, I guess they feel, more so than, well, there are a couple of guys and they've resurrected a hypothesis that's pretty thoroughly debunked, but here's what they have to say. That's not nearly as exciting as these two maverick scientists are changing what we know about the story of the peopling of the Americas.
Well, and it's interesting that you say those words, Ken, because one of the problems I had with this show early on was, especially at the introduction of the show, was the language that was being used specifically to describe the two maverick scientists and the dissenters thereof. And they literally began the show with "many people believe," and then went to describe the Bering Strait theory. And I'm like, those many people who believe that are actual scientists who have evidence, and that's why they believe that. But the way they kind of made it sound was, there's this group of people who think this thing for some reason, and here's our two guys who know everything else. And it's just like the way they set the show up was very leading. And I guess I was just really surprised by it, considering the reputation that the nature of things as a continuing series seems to have. I was just very taken aback by the fact that they would even contemplate covering something like the Solutrean hypothesis, which is so thoroughly unacceptable.
Yeah, it is very disappointing. I mean, the production value of this
the show was beautiful.
Amazing. I really enjoyed watching it. But I really enjoyed watching it. And the footage was beautiful, and the reenactments were really cool. And I thoroughly enjoyed the parts that I got to do about it. But I was really sad to see that they decided to go with the unscientific perspective on this. Maybe it made for good storytelling, but it was inaccurate. And at the end of the day, isn't that the most?
Well, you and I might agree with that, but I'm not so sure that producers of television shows would agree with that. But I think you make a really good point, Jen, when you're talking about how you really got into the weeds about the statistics, and that's true. But here's the thing: a 45-minute, once you subtract commercials, a 45-minute documentary, not really strong on nuance and complexity. And so it's just much easier to have these two hairy men who they're fighting the status quo or fighting the consensus, and they're out there with really exciting visuals as the water is lapping up around that cliff face from where they're extracting artifacts and charcoal. That's really a compelling story, and it's entertainment. And that's not Bruce Bradley's fault, or Dennis Stanford. That is the nature of television. Yeah. And that's unfortunate. I mean, I encounter this all the time where I'll have a talking head thing on some show about ancient aliens or Atlantis, and people will write me and saying, well, but you didn't answer this, and this. And I say, you know what? Read a book. And now that gives you the opportunity to go into all of the complexity of this argument where, a talking head thing in a little TV show really doesn't, that's why scientists don't put out movies about their results. They write books or write detailed articles. Mm-hmm. But reading is harder than watching television.
Oh, yeah. And that's a frustrating thing, is because in the interviews that they were shooting with me, I tried to convey the weight of evidence by talking about genomics, right? Which is, well, get into it if you want. We did discuss this a lot on the last time I was on the show, but the genomics, how strongly that supports the current model for Beringian origin of the ancestors of Native Americans.
Right.
Versus their idea, which is based on a single genetic marker, mitochondrial haplogroup X, which is not even accurate the way they're using it. But, even if I gave it to them, which I'm not, but even if I did, that's one marker versus the entire genome, which says something else entirely. Right. So, and I said that, but they actually cut out everything I said about genomics, which is terrible because it really is sort of the right metaphor.
Well, I know you said that we've talked about this before the last time you were on, and that's fine. We're going to link to that episode as well, but can you just kind of refresh listeners' memories on what the exact difference is and what that nuance is?
Sure, and maybe we should back up and sort of recap what their claims about the genetics are, right? So I'm not going to get into the archaeology myself because I will leave that to the archaeologist. So that's all you can, but
okay, that's fine. I can talk a little bit about that
points and stuff, but I can talk about the archaeology. I'm sorry, talking about the genetics. So the claim that these guys are making, and they've brought on Stephen Oppenheimer, who's I guess he's he's a popular science writer, genetics type person. He's not a specialist in Native American genetics at all. But anyway, they make the case in a paper in the journal Paleo America that haplogroup X2A, which is one of the founder haplogroups that we see in Native Americans, is actually from Europe, is actually a genetic marker of the Solutrean migration.
Now, this is what he's claiming.
Yes. Now, they have a lot of different arguments for that. One of them being that you see haplogroup X at high frequencies in different European populations. And this is one of the arguments that was made explicitly in the movie.
Yes.
And the problem with that is that you have to look at the actual lineage, right? So we talk about haplogroups. Those are sort of groupings of individual lineages that are closely related by recent common ancestry.
And these are all mitochondrial haplogroups. Right?
Yeah. And I'm sorry, I should have explained mitochondrial DNA versus the whole genome. The mitochondrial DNA is that independent genome that you inherit just from your mother. And it's only maternally inherited, and you find it in the mitochondria of your cells. It's separate from your chromosomes or your nuclear DNA. Mm-hmm. Okay? It's about, it's a much smaller genome. It's circular. So we count it basically as a single mark because the entire mitochondrial genome is inherited. Okay.
And since you only inheriting it from your mother, it's not every generation there's a mixture of mothers and fathers' DNA and making that extremely complicated. It's the mother. It's from mother to children, from female to from mom to the kids,
which makes it a very reliable way of tracking things.
It is a reliable way, but it's also a reduced way, right?
Oh, okay.
So
sure.
Compare, the entire genome and how massive that is versus, 16,000 something base pairs, which is the mitochondrial genome, which are all inherited together. So we count it as a single marker. It's therefore more subjected, more sensitive to evolutionary forces like genetic drift.
Okay.
And that's kind of
sure.
be important later. Okay. So the haplogroup, so we have haplogroups, and that's like related lineages. Think about it like a family tree, it's like close relatives, okay? But when we're talking about, when we're looking at individual histories, if we want to look at it very high resolution, you've got to look at the whole mitochondrial genome, and we're looking at individual lineages, haplotypes or individual lineages. The version of haplogroup X that's in Europe, the one that Oppenheimer and Bradley and Stanford are referring to, is not ancestral to X2A, which is the lineage found in the Americas. It's not ancestral. It's more like a sister or a cousin. So they share a common ancestor, right, which, the best we can tell, was from the Middle East, but it's not at all ancestral. In fact, nothing ancestral to X2A can be found in Europe right now, as far as we know.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So that argument doesn't work. And what drives me absolutely bonkers about this particular show was that they went back and said, okay, we're going to look at these ancient people. I forget which tribe it was now.
Right, in Canada.
In Canada, yeah. They were going to look at...
the Huron...
Yeah.
But they had a second name.
Okay, yes. They were going to look at some ancient DNA from their ancestors and see if they could evidence for Solutreans in those ancient individuals. And I had actually told the producer or director, she had come to me, hey, we've got these samples from ancient individuals. Would you like to work on them? And I said, well, first of all, do their descendants support that work? Because of course, you don't do that work. You shouldn't do that work unless it's supported by the descendant community. And she's like, oh, yeah, they're totally into it. And I'm like, okay, well, what do you want me to do? And she said, well, do mitochondrial DNA. And I said, well, that's not going to tell you anything. If there's haplogroup X in this region, it's not going to be a surprise. We already know that there's...
Right, yeah, that was the thing
we already know this. It's not...
That was the thing, that was so strange in the show, that this was a big revelation.
It's not going to do anything. Yeah. And I told her that. I said the only thing that will really test the Solutrean hypothesis is you've got to look at the whole genome. And if you see evidence of recent European ancestry in these individuals with haplogroup X, then you're on to something. Then that could be kind of interesting. And because these, of course, all predate, the European contact. And she's like, well, how long would that take? And I said, well, it's going to take a while to analyze complete genomes. And she's like, well, we've got a production schedule. So in the end, they went with, Oppenheimer, and he found some lab over in England to do it. But the fact that they presented the finding of X2A in these ancient individuals as solid proof of a Solutrean hypothesis, it's ludicrous. And I told them that before they even started the work. So my challenge to anybody, to the producers, anybody who's listening to this who really finds this compelling argument, is let me do the whole genomes. I'll do it, and we'll test this hypothesis. That's all you need to do in order to really get at it.
The people that they worked with, the descent group they worked with, was the Huron Wendat. And I'm sure I mutilated that. But yeah, it's the Huron Wendat. And they, in the video anyway, it looked like they were very eager to be working with the show and the scientists that the show brought along with them. But at the same time, I have this really bad feeling that they were kind of due. Specifically because they had one of their, I don't know if he was an elder or just a representative of the tribe, but he donated, I think it was somewhere between something like 46 teeth of known burials of their ancestral dead, and 3 of those teeth produced this haplogroup X. And I noticed that the show was very careful to call it haplogroup X and very rarely mentioned that it was X2A, which...
I saw how they tested it if they just looked at some of the older methods of looking at typing these, which would do it was X.
I think ultimately they did say it was X2A, and that's why they made a big deal about it. But what I found really interesting, at one point they have this very beautiful graphic, and it's a map of the world. It's kind of an antique-looking map. And they have little red dots for all the places where, and here's where it gets kind of bait and switch, X or X2A show up. Yeah. And on this map, there's a lot of stuff in the northern part of the United States, X2A, and then there's a lot of red dots in Western Europe and in the Middle East. And there are no dots anywhere else. And I think any casual observer is going to say, oh my God, case closed. All the red dots mean connections, and it's all Europe and it's all North America. So American Indians are Europeans.
Yeah, that's not true.
Right.
Well, I asked you about this before, that the general X, isn't there X in like Lake Baikal, which is it's not Eastern Asia, but that was missing from the map. There was no red dot in Siberia, and they specifically said you never find X in Eastern Asia or in Alaska.
Oh, wow. Well, I missed that, but
no, they said that for sure.
Yeah, they did. Yeah.
Wow. Well, so yes, X, and I forget which haplotype of X it is, but has been found in Asia around the lake and specifically around Lake Baikal. And that made everybody very excited because that's thought to be where all the other founder lineages, the ancestors of the founder lineages originated, right? A, B, C, and D. And so when X was found there, everybody's like, okay, we finally solved the mystery of X. It's here. But the way that was identified was a sort of an older method. I won't get into the details, but it doesn't give you this high resolution. So you can't really do the sort of family trees that we kind of do nowadays.
Right.
For understanding the relationships between these lineages. And so it turns out that the haplogroup X that was found there was not ancestral to X2A either.
Wow.
Okay.
So it's not, right? So yeah, it's very interesting. So that if X2A, or the ancestor of X2A is what we call an autochthonous Native American haplogroup, which means it's only found in Native Americans. If X2A's ancestor was in Europe, in Siberia, as we would predict from the standard model,
the Bering Strait,
it's not present in populations today there. So, or it just hasn't been found yet.
Right. Okay.
So what we say, most of us geneticists would say was, well, we see lots and lots of evidence for populations moving around. Present day distributions of lineages are not the same today as they are in the past. We see lots of population turnover. Genetic drift could definitely eliminate specific lineages from populations. And so you can't take present day patterns of genetic variation as indicative of what was there in the past. Absolutely not. And that's like the major lesson ancient DNA has taught us, right? So there's a very good reason why we might not see X2A in present day populations there. What we need to do is go back and look at ancient DNA from people in that area, and we might actually find it. I would predict we would find it, but we just haven't done that yet, or the remains are not available, and it just hasn't been done. So yeah, but importantly for this argument, what the Solutrean hypothesis proponents are saying is, well, we don't see the ancestors of X2A in Asia, therefore it came from Europe. But we don't see the ancestors of X2A in Europe either. So really, you can't really take that as evidence, particularly one way or the other. So
right. I know we're going to go to a break soon, but I want to share one thing. This a funny coincidence is that Deborah Bolnick, who is a colleague of Jennifer's, another geneticist, an anthropological geneticist, and me and Brad Lepper and I can't remember Carrie Barnhart, a historian, were involved in a documentary called The Lost Civilizations of America, in which there was their geneticist made the connection between X in the Middle East and X in North America as part of the argument that the Indians, in fact, are members of the Lost Tribes of Israel. So there's been a lot of kind of funny use of the X haplogroup in order to prove somebody's pet theory or pet hypothesis.
Yeah. All right, well, let's go to break real quick, and when we come back, we will maybe move on to the archaeology a little bit and talk about what physical evidence we have to support the Solutrean hypothesis.
This network is supported by our listeners. You can become a supporting member by going to arcpodnet.com/members and signing up. As a supporting member, you have access to high-quality downloads of each show and a discount at our future online store, and access to show hosts on a members-only Slack team. For professional members, we'll have training shows and other special content offered throughout the year. Once again, go to arcpodnet.com/members to support the network and get some great extras and swag in the process. That's arcpodnet.com/members.
Hey everyone, and we are back, and we are still discussing the CBC show, The Nature of Things, their Ice Bridge episode, specifically discussing the Solutrean Hypothesis. I know there's a lot to unpack there, but Jennifer gave us a great breakdown of the genetics, which was one of the keystones for the show. I felt like they were really hyping the genetic stuff a lot, hoping that it was going to be the magic nail in the coffin of this very unpopular theory. But they also, early in the show, presented a lot of physical evidence, or at least I feel like they brought some items out in a way as to suggest they were evidence when I don't feel they actually were. Does that make sense? And
yeah, I mean, the thing is, remember that the genetics is relatively a recent add-on
right.
to the testing of this hypothesis. I mean, this thing has been around for a long time, and it's all been based on archaeology, on physical, on material remains, and the DNA has only been sort of grafted onto the argument fairly recently because that data was not available previously.
Genetics is a new tool in the archaeology toolbox, so it's new for all of us. But so until we had the genetics to use like this, we had to stick with, artifacts and stuff. And I'm sure everybody's really familiar with the Solutrean point that gets a lot of airtime every now and then. The original one being found near the Chesapeake by a dredger, one of the dredging ships that was dredging for, I believe it was clams or mussels. And the major problem with that point is, I mean, it's a real point. It's obviously real. But the problem with its provenience and its context is it was drug up out of the bottom of the ocean with no recording or anything to it, and it just kind of sat around until somebody handed it off to one of the local museums, and it made its way into the hands of Bradley and Stanford. And
That's the Sinmar
Sinfor
there are a lot of questions about Sinmar, and there are a lot of questions about provenience. But at the site that they showed in the documentary, to be fair, they're finding very similar looking spear points. Some of them in situ in the wall, a lot of them apparently washed out. But see, the deal there is Bruce Bradley is probably he is for sure one of the preeminent lithic analysts and lithic replicators. Actually, one of my undergraduate students went and was a grad student under Bradley at Exeter College. This is Matt Sweeten, who is just a spectacular lithicist, and he's now in grad school in New Zealand. Bruce is extremely knowledgeable about this, but the bottom line here is that Bradley's argument has always been that there are some very, very deep similarities. It's not just gross morphological similarities between the lithic technology of the Solutreans and the lithic technology of Clovis and pre-Clovis here in the New. He lists off, I think it's 11 very specific things that he says as somebody who knows how to make stone tools. These things it's beyond coincidence that these constellations of trace appear. However, the thing that shows up again and again and again, the single thing that seems to be the basis for the argument are overshot flakes. When you're making a stone tool, for the most part, very commonly, as people are thinning the biface, they shoot flakes halfway across from one edge of the flake to the other. And they do that all along one edge. They turn around, continue on that edge. And so the flakes meet up in the middle, and there's this kind of medial ridge. And then you do it on the other face of the flake. Some technologies have full-face flaking, where the flake goes all across almost or all the way to the edge on the other side. And that's fairly common as well. What's uncommon is this overshot technique where the flake goes across the entire face and actually then hooks around and takes stone off of the other face. Francois Bourd, who was kind of the guy who kind of invented the lexicon for stone tool analysis in France, called those outrepassés, and here in America we call them overshot flakes. And the deal is, Bradley says, and most people agree, it's not a very common technique. You don't find it in a lot of places, but it is much more common in Solutrean and in Clovis. Even so, we're still talking about 10, 11, 12%. It's not the technique used for thinning bifaces. And Bradley points out that Solutrean and Clovis are extremely thin. They are among the very thinnest of technologies. Was the guy Joni Ive, who works for Apple, and he's the guy who designs all of their stuff. And he's just obsessed about making iPads thinner and thinner, and iMacs thinner and thinner, and the iPhones thinner and thinner. Well, apparently Clovis and Solutrean, they were like that. They wanted these things to be extremely thin. And so there's the deal that Bradley is saying. Bradley's hypothesis is perfectly reasonable. We have two technologies. They have a lot of similarities. Maybe there's a genetic connection, genetic metaphorically and genetic literally among the makers. But people who know Solutrean tools, people like Mike Waters, who was in the show, who know Clovis, say, that really isn't enough. That we find in many instances, and we've talked about diffusion on this podcast previously. You find technologies that are very similar, and they're the result of convergence. That individuals on different sides of the world may be solving exactly the same challenges, and they come up with the same sequences. And even though it's unlikely, it's rare. Unlikely and rare things happen as people are trying to solve challenges posed by making stone tools out of stone, making stone tools. And so it's an interesting hypothesis, but where's the evidence that would be definitive or diagnostic? And for most people, no, that's just not there. They thought the DNA was going to be, no, this will be the evidence that absolutely proves our point. But as Jen is telling us, well, no, they are not using the DNA and the DNA results in a way that makes their case.
No, they're not. And in fact, we have a burial of a child who was buried with Clovis points. Now, we can argue about whether or not those points were actually associated with that child. I know there's some arguments about that, but they were in the same grave, right? And that child's DNA shows not a trace of European ancestry. And similarly, we have the oldest individual with haplogroup X2A, that's the ancient one, Kennewick man, who's on the West Coast, not the East Coast, and he has not a trace of European ancestry in the rest of his genome. So, these arguments the preponderance of the evidence does not support the Solutrean hypothesis in any way, shape, or form.
Right. I mean, the equivalent evidence for somebody looking at stone tools, for the DNA evidence, would be trace element chemistry of stone tools in the Chesapeake Bay, in New England, in Florida, or wherever that could be traced not to any stone source in the New World, but could be directly traceable to a source in France or Spain. And they didn't talk about that at all. The weird thing about the show, and I think this is kind of general, is that they do talk about lithic sources. And they make this kind of casual argument that, well, as soon as the Solutrean people came to the New World, first thing they did was they found the right rock to make stone tools. Now, I'm going to tell you, living here in Connecticut, that would have been a pretty challenge because the rock is not abundant, it's not ubiquitous. Good rock for knapping, and in fact, there are stone tool types, there are stone raw material types that we still don't know exactly where they came from in Connecticut because it took the natives a long time to figure that stuff out, and we don't even know where those sources are. So I think that's kind of that kind of blasé thing. Oh, they would have showed up and then they would have started banging rocks. All right, maybe, but would they not have been bringing along stone tools from wherever they came from until they were able to adapt to the new lithic resources? And if that's the case, okay, let's do some neutron activation or ion microprobe analysis and be able to say, you know what? These stones are not from anywhere in North America. They come from somewhere else. And that's the kind of stuff that was done with some of the Norse material that we saw that was found in Newfoundland. Soapstone found at Alonso Meadow was not from Newfoundland; it was from Greenland. Those are the kinds of definitive arguments or definitive evidence that would really help their argument. But that's not even addressed in the show, and I think that's not addressed in the show because that evidence simply has not yet been presented. It doesn't exist, or they just haven't found it yet. But that's not convincing.
No, but I think one of my other problems with the show, though, it revolves around the spear points themselves. Again, we're coming back to the language that was being used by the show, not by the scientists in the show, but by the narrator and I would assume the script writer. Things like claiming that this technology was super advanced and claiming that this technology vanished after these people were no longer seen, after we can no longer trace these people in the Americas. And it's My problem is it's language that is incredibly similar to pseudo-archaeology shows that we see, like Ancient Aliens and Scott Walder's show, Unearthing America, and things like that. So I was a little distressed to hear them describing the Solutreans, these supposed Solutreans, in a way that not only made them sound like they were great culture bearers, but of course there's the overall tone of the show suggesting that the Solutreans were actually European, or at least not addressing and denying that that would not have been true. It just, to me, it just kind of set off red flags for me, and like, I did not like the language that was being used to describe this stuff, whether they were addressing it being true or not. And I really felt like I don't think they were doing it intentionally, but it was very sensational. And in the long run, and this is another point we're going to get to much later on in the show, I think, but the whole unsavory part of the Solutrean hypothesis and how it's been adopted by certain groups in the modern era, which does also, again, loop back to the genetics and the whole hypothesis of Haplogroup X being a European blood genetics line.
Yeah, but I caught that too, Sarah. And it was all, I think it's all part of the narrative. The brave, fearless, hardy explorers who happen to be Europeans are traveling across this very dangerous expanse and coming to the New World. And they do, you're right, they mentioned several times these were very advanced people. And they were. So were the Native Americans who were living there at the time.
Did you notice that they had white skin? I mean, no, Europeans at that time would not have
been white,
white skin. So
it's right.
No, they would not have. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it was problematic. But again, they are telling, this is a saga of bravery. This is a saga of the imagination, and that's going to draw people in to watch it, whether it's accurate or not. Unfortunately, even in a science show, that kind of stuff becomes secondary. One more thing I should add is that overshot technology, that becomes such a linchpin in the argument, that's present in Solutrean. It's present in Clovis, but it's not present in pre-Clovis. And Solutrean dates to 5,000 or 6,000 years before Clovis. So you kind of have this impression that, well, the Solutrean came over, they abandoned the overshot technology, right? And they become Clovis, who 5,000 years later reintroduce overshot flake into their technology. There's a real problem with that.
Yeah, their timelines don't quite match up, and I feel like that was just an oversight in research, probably, when people were researching the show and the timelines that they were coming up with. Because we've seen that kind of stuff happen before. The whole, like...
Jen, can I ask you... Yeah, I want to ask Jen a question. And that is the other. What are the other haplogroups found in North America, and how are is there the same kind of real challenge in sourcing those or in writing their evolutionary history? So what's up with the other haplogroups?
No, the other haplogroups are A, B, C, and D, and of course we have subtypes, right? So it's like A to A, all that. Right, I'm really being really general here. And no, we have dated their coalescence, and it's roughly similar to that of X, right? So that's one line of evidence that's kind of convincing that they all came from the same place. And in models, they all match the model that we would expect of a what we call the Beringian incubation or the Beringian pause, that people lived somewhere. Some people argue for Beringia itself. Some people argue for Asia. Isolated from all other populations for some period of some thousands of years, and people quibble about how long that period would have been. But the other haplogroups' ancestors can be clearly traced to Siberia. So X is the only anomalous one with regard to not finding the ancestral haplogroups there. But like I say, I really think the most plausible explanation for that lack is genetic drift, and that we haven't gotten enough, archaeological material, enough individuals dating to, 20, 30,000 years ago from Siberia to test whether or not any of them had haplogroup X. So I would really predict that, that's what we should find. And I could also make predictions for the Solutrean hypothesis if it were true. And I think it's important to go through that exercise, right? If it were true, what would we expect to see genetically? right? So I would expect to find evidence of European ancestry in well-dated remains, remains from individuals in pre-contact contexts, presumably on the East Coast, and it should be unambiguous. But we have not seen that. We have not seen any trace of that whatsoever. So, if we find it, I'll change my mind. I really will. I mean, if we find it, I hope I'm the one to find it, because that would be a very exciting result. But it's not going to happen, I don't think.
Right.
But the problem with these guys who are the proponents of the Solutrean hypothesis, aside from not considering the ramifications of this, which I assume we're going to get into,
right,
cultural ramifications, they're not being scientific about it. They absolutely, there's nothing you can do. There's no scenario that they can concoct in their heads that will disprove what they're saying, right? You cannot show them any evidence that will make them question their idea. I challenged the director and the producers of the show. I said, ask them on camera what kind of evidence they would need to see to change their mind, to falsify their hypothesis. And I don't know if she did or not, or if they did or not, but it certainly didn't make it into the show. And I don't really think there is anything that would challenge it. And that's not scientific.
Right. I will stand up a little tiny bit for Bruce Bradley, that at least in his publications, where he comes to the following conclusion. He is very sure that this hypothesis is correct, but he admits it is not settled science. However, Dennis Stanford was asked in the show about this. He is absolutely dead certain that the Solutrean hypothesis is correct. And it's not just a band here, a band here. He says they're here in great numbers.
Yeah.
And he's absolutely certain. And Brent's not asked that in the show, but at least in print, he is pretty sure. But he admits that, okay, this isn't settled science. There's still more to be done.
Well, if I can say that the fact that they think they were here in great numbers, and I suppose they're taking that from the, abundance of Clovis tools and sites that we see everywhere.
Right.
I mean, that's a reasonable conclusion. Then we should see some genetic signature of them being here, right? So in the documentary, they kind of close with having me talking about the Vikings being here and not leaving any genetic trace. And what I was saying after that was, well, we would expect to see a trace of the Solutreans if they were here as abundantly as they were supposed to have been here, right? It's kind of a different scenario, but, of course that didn't make it in. But and in fact, they actually use it to make it sound like I kind of was leaving the door open for this.
But I think that's really interesting, though, because comparing the Vikings and the Solutreans, the Solutreans, if they had come over, would have stayed. And I know at one point I think it's Stanford that they have. He's like, yeah, I think maybe some of them stayed and some of them went back. And it's like, that's just insane. Like, just the amount of time it would take to have gotten here for them to just be like, whoop, and just go home. But he does say they stayed. And I would just expect to see occupation sites. I would expect to see, like you were saying, the trickle down of genetic data. And I don't think anybody on that show is denying that the Bering Strait migration happened at all. I think what they're trying to say is that this is an also, like another migration. Just this one happened before, and then there must have been some kind of intermixing once they gravitated more towards the middle of the. But you would see that in the genes of the different peoples that were left behind.
Jennifer, can I ask a naive genetics question?
Sure.
Which would be, look, these Solutreans who are bringing X over, what is the likelihood that 100% of them are X and there are no other European haplogroups in this migrant population? Is it possible it's 100% X?
Well, it depends on the size of the population that came over, right? So if we're talking about maybe one family and like a maternal clan,
right?
And it was a few people. Yeah, okay, I could see them all being X maybe. But I mean, small numbers, right? But unless X was at fixation in the Solutrean population, which I find, unlikely, that's a really good point that we should see other haplogroups. And furthermore, what we should consider is the fact that we don't have any Solutrean remains, so we have no idea what Solutreans looked like genetically. They're just assuming that they had haplogroup X, but we don't know. We don't know anything about them genetically.
So that's really interesting. So what you're saying is we don't have a genetic identity for the Solutrean people, even over in the areas in Europe where they're found.
We know what other later Europeans, and I hate to use the term European, right, because there's all sorts of problems there.
Right,
let's just for the sake of simplicity, we know that there were changes to the gene pool in that region, drastic changes over time, right? And so who was there in the past probably almost certainly did not look like genetically like people there in the present. And yet they're using present day distributions of Haplogroup X in, the Orkney population. And
right. Yeah.
Yeah. They're using that as evidence for the fact that the Solutreans must have brought X2A over. It doesn't make any sense. It's a really bad argument. And I wish that people could understand that. I wish the producers could have understood that. Yeah.
Let's go to break real quick, and when we come back, let's unpackage this whole using modern peoples to describe ancient peoples, because that's sort of where all of the unsavoriness is coming from.
The Archaeology Podcast Network has partnered with TeePublic to bring you some awesome gear that looks good, promotes archaeology, and puts a few pennies in our pockets so you can get free podcasts. Check out our designs at arcpodnet.com/shop. That's arcpodnet.com/shop.
Hey everyone, and we are back, and we are still talking about the Nature of Things newest episode, the Ice Bridge, and more specifically the Solutrean Hypothesis. And we've got Jennifer Raff with us, and that's great because we have been discussing genetics, and we're going to keep discussing them because part of the problem with the Solutrean Hypothesis is the modern groups that have embraced it as evidence of white Europeans being the first peoples in the Americas.
Right.
Ken, you had something you wanted to...
Understand that, Bruce Bradley and Dennis Stanford and the producers of the show, they weren't thinking about that. These are not white supremacists who are out to propose that Europeans got here first. But what this reminded me of, Jennifer mentioned Kennewick Man, or the ancient one. When that skeleton was first discovered, forensic archaeologist Jim Chatters out in that part of the world looked at it, and based on gross morphology, he used the word Caucasoid to describe it. Now, understand that at the time, he thought it was probably a white settler based, again, on gross morphology. He thought it was recent because it was really well preserved. Turns out to be, 8,500 to 9,000 years old. And folks glommed onto that. Individuals had nothing to do with Jim Chatters. They're not archaeologists, but they glommed onto that term he used, Caucasoid, to claim, this ancient individual was a white guy. And what is it, like the Asatru National Assembly of Latter-day Vikings said, he's our ancestor. We were here first. And I'm sure that when Chatters used the word Caucasoid, he had no notion that at some point, because of a series of analyses, primarily the radiocarbon dating, that it would actually have, that his calling it Caucasoid would have political implications. He had no idea. It's a little bit different now in that certainly the people working on this documentary, the producers, being aware of the political climate, have to know that we are now looking at, I don't know if it's an expansion or explosion of white supremacists, of people really kind of out there, racists, and what other name you can give to these odious folks who are necessarily, it's predictable that if you're talking about people coming from Europe, they're going to say, the first Americans were white folks.
Oh, they knew the political implications. We had discussions before.
So how did that go, Jennifer? What did that sound like?
Well, I brought it up. I said, look, this Solutrean hypothesis is just the latest iteration of a long tradition of Europeans trying to insert ourselves into American prehistory. And this is, I say ourselves because I am descended from Europe. This is, just the latest iteration of it. And while, Bradley and Stanford are certainly not racist by anything I know about them, they need to consider the implications of this hypothesis. I mean, you guys, I'm right now, I'm sorry I did this because it's awful, but I just Googled Stormfront and Solutrean, and guess what? There's an active thread about this.
I'm not surprised. I am not surprised.
Yeah, and they're talking about all this. So, I told the producers, look, you need to be careful because not only is this hypothesis unscientific, and I mean, in its current form, right? Originally, it was fair game to be discussed, I think, but it was so thoroughly debunked by all the evidence that it's not a good, sound hypothesis anymore. So the scientific issue aside, this is racist. I mean, there's no good way around it. There's, you can't, I don't want to put a polite spin on it. It is. It's claiming that Europeans brought technologies to the Americas and gave them to the Native Americans or were ancestral to the Native Americans in some way or another. And, you need to consider the implications of this. And they agreed with me, and they're like, oh, yeah, this is very problematic. But we don't really want to talk about all of that. We don't really want to bring that all in. Bruce and Dennis are not racists, and, they're not responsible for how their ideas are being used. So that's kind of where it went. And I think you can kind of get a sense of that from articles that have come out since then, the interviews. So I feel like that could have been handled a lot better.
It could have been handled a lot better.
So,
I mean, as Jennifer and Ken have both said, we are not in any way saying that Bruce Bradley and Dennis Sanford are racist. What we are saying is that their hypothesis has been adopted by racist groups. And it's well known. And I know that Bradley and Sanford are, I would be very suspicious of them claiming that they're not aware of that. And I don't think they did. But the director of the show was asked about this in an interview directly about the racist implications of this hypothesis and the way the show is kind of championing it. And they asked her, how do you feel about people saying that you are bringing back this hypothesis that is blatantly racist? And she's like, well, I mean, we knew about it, but I just think it's silly. And it's like, well, I'm really sorry that you think it's silly, but you're doing a lot of damage in the process. And I felt like it was very dismissive and very poo-pooey of a very serious problem. Like you said, this is being discussed on Stormfront. There's we had Jeb on the show one time talking about how there are people who are white nationalists who are out in front and center about it and have on their social media profiles their genetic profile to prove how white they are, because they've really bought into this Haplogroup X thing and these European blood genetic lines that run through them, and that makes them super white, and that makes them more in their social groups. And unfortunately, the Solutrean hypothesis has been adopted by them and is pushed very hard by them to prove that white Europeans were the first people here, and therefore all other groups are either interlopers or violent conquerors. And I feel like it was very irresponsible of the show to not at least address that these are some of the repercussions of a theory like this.
Yeah, I'm going to guess. I don't know Bruce or Dennis. I met Bruce once, and from all I hear from my student who had him as a prof, he's a great guy. My guess is that both Bruce and Dennis probably didn't expect their little Solutrean hypothesis that they probably figured about 200 people in the world would have really cared about would be glommed onto.
How could they possibly have known? How could they possibly have known?
Right.
Well, I mean, you can know if you know the history of the discipline, though, right? You look at how biology is used to justify colonialism. I mean,
right.
If you have some self-awareness of our history, maybe you could anticipate this, but maybe physical anthropologists, biological anthropologists think about this a bit more than archaeologists. I don't know, because we have really this, really dark history in our discipline.
Right.
But, so you could potentially know, but regardless, they know now. They have to know how it's
right. That's
to justify
my point.
This, and it's not to say that you should go where the science leads you. Of course, you should. You have a responsibility to talk about the implications, and I would argue that it would be great if those two would come out and and stand against the way that this idea is being used.
And better to be proactive than reactive.
Yeah.
Right? Better to come out and say, hey, listen, there are these crazy people who think somehow that the Solutrean hypothesis supports their racist agenda. It absolutely doesn't. We don't want anything to do with those sons of bitches. And now let's move on. We're going to look at science.
Right.
Here. And it doesn't, and any of the implications that they're drawing from them are categorically wrong. That could have been done in the show.
Yes. I wish it had been.
I feel like it should have been.
Yeah.
That would have been a much...
I have an extremely long grant about this so people can read all.
Yeah, there's...
Oh my
actually...
like several days.
This when this episode went live, because it went live a whole week before we were able to get hold of it, and it caused a bit of a storm on what is now being called archaeological Twitter. And there have been several people who have penned responses to it, and this is a reoccurring theme in pretty much all of them, including some that are just Twitter threads. They're not even full-blown blog posts. It's just the pointing out of nobody is calling anyone in that show directly racist. What they're saying is the way the show presented this hypothesis was incredibly irresponsible, and they took no time to try to correct any of the misconceptions that are held by groups like white supremacists about what the Solutreans, or who the Solutreans were. Because as we said in the segment before this, even if we pretend there's a grain of truth to this, the people that we classify as Solutrean would not have been white or really European. So even at the heart of it, this Solutrean hypothesis is not really saying white Europeans made it to America first. It's just how it's being interpreted by unsavory groups in the modern era, because as Jennifer was pointing out, they're comparing the area that the Solutreans would have been inhabiting. They're comparing the genetic makeup of modern people with what they want the ancient people to be like.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah. And if I can make a plug, probably before this episode comes out, so next Wednesday, I'm going to be writing a piece for my column in The Guardian. So it'll be on this. So
excellent.
To read my Twitter thoughts, they'll be there. It's for our blog, The Past and the Curious. So
excellent. And then so what we'll be able to do is we'll be able to link it to our page so that when the show comes out, people can then link to that article and read it.
Yeah, and I don't think we can have enough people, especially archaeologists and bioanthropologists and people who know. I don't think we can have enough of us getting out there and saying things like, this isn't true. And it's not just the hypothesis not being supported by evidence. It's the whole concept isn't true. Like, even if you were to find evidence that support that Solutreans did somehow make it across an ice bridge that may or may not have existed, we don't have evidence for that either. And then somehow peopled the Americas before the migration across the land bridge, it still doesn't make them white Europeans. So.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And it's so frustrating, it's frustrating from that perspective, and it's frustrating from a scientific perspective. I mean, there are so many more interesting questions that are going on in the cutting edge research as to, the genetics and the archaeology of the Americas. And, having to waste our time on this nonsense is just really frustrating. And many of my colleagues are frustrated. Like, okay, Jenny, you go do this because we got to work on this other stuff.
Well, I wonder, and I don't know if you know this, Jen, and I don't know if you'd like to talk about it, but were other professionals approached about participating in the show who just said, this is bullshit, this is nonsense, we don't want to be involved?
I think so, yes. I don't know the specifics, but I think we did approach a number of geneticists, and, most people were busy. I mean, it's not that I'm not busy too, but, I feel like having written a paper on this, I needed to continue to, talk about it.
Sure.
But I mean, I know that I referred archaeologists and other geneticists to the producers of the show who did have conversations with them. But in the end, they were going to write it and frame the episode the way they were going to do it. So I don't think a lot of people are particularly interested in revisiting this question when they have so much more interesting research that they're doing, and it's eating up their time. So, I should be doing it. And anyway, just,
But I mean, you're right. I mean, I think it's a reflection of the fact, I just say that it's a reflection of the fact that for most geneticists and most archaeologists, this is settled. This is a settled issue.
Oh, yeah.
Why do we want to go back and revisit it again and again and again? We're done with this. Let's move on.
So, yeah, we really wish that, many of us really wish we could convince the public that, there's just no evidence for it. So let's talk about this other stuff that we're doing that's really cool. But, if you just cannot get past this sticking point of Europeans were here, it's so frustrating. And it ties into, this whole long narrative that you guys are talking about on your podcast, which is the appeal, the seductive appeal of pseudoscience and pseudoarchaeology, and how, sort of these lost civilizations it really captivates the public's attention. And the maverick archaeologist trope, they love it.
Right.
And so this plays right into that. And that's why, it's sort of the hypothesis that will never die, not for, evidentiary reasons, but because the public is just fascinated by it.
No, I was just going to say, one of the other things that builds onto that is what we were talking about earlier in the show, like reading's hard and watching a television show isn't. And the things that are getting made into television shows are the sensational claims because they're entertaining. And it's like a feedback loop, People watch the entertaining shows because they're entertaining. So I'm going to make more of the entertaining shows, and the thing that's entertaining is pseudoscience, and then I feel like it would be very difficult to approach a producer at this point and be like, I want to make a show about the reality of archaeology. And I don't want to make a show about, digging up people and up somebody's privy and how much these things I'm finding are worth. I just want to make a show about the real world of archaeology. And I don't think any producer would go for it because it just sounds boring to them. But if I were to go up to them and be like, I want to do a show about the archaeology of ghosts. We're going to dig up ghost skeletons and then we're going to evaluate how much the ghost skeletons worth. I bet you I could find 3 producers that would be like, you are on. I could probably get at least a season. But it's ridiculous, But that's what people want to watch. And I think the best thing we can do to counter that is, keep things like the podcast going. I mean, we have a very popular podcast, and I appreciate every single one of our listeners because I appreciate the message getting out there. But, there's no Archaeofantasies TV show. There's no, I don't even know, there used to be a YouTube channel, but I tell you what, editing videos in the ass, so.
There should be a TV show because the history is so fascinating and it's so much more interesting than, silly ideas like that. So, yeah.
Well, that's part of the problem I've actually been approached by more than one documentary producers about being involved in an archaeology show. And the 2 words that come up again and again and again, it's from different producers. The words are mystery and treasure. I'm absolutely serious. And when I've pitched ideas, like Sarah, like you said, my newest book is the Ancient America 50 archaeological sites you can see for yourself, and it's about real places and real archaeology. And when I have when I've spoken to producers and pitched that, the question they ask is, well, do any of these sites involve mysteries, and will you find treasures there? So I try to bullshit them and say, well, the mystery is that not enough Americans know about these cool places, and the treasure is in the knowledge we gain by studying these places. And nobody's buying what I'm selling. So no, there have to be real, genuine mysteries and genuine treasure, and that's because of Oak Island, and that's because of America Under Earth. That's because of what already has a proven track record of gathering listeners. That's what they want. They want to replicate that, and they don't want something new, and because that's dangerous. Maybe nobody will listen because it's not interesting.
They don't want it to be too challenging because they don't want their audience to feel like they're being talked down to.
See, I reject that. I think that the public is
smart. I think they are, but that's the excuse that they get.
They are fascinated by this sort of thing. If they were just given the chance to investigate it or to be presented with the real science. I mean, that's certainly been my experience with, writing for The Guardian. Like, the readers there are very engaged and really smart, and they appreciate it when you give them the actual science.
Well, our listeners are like that when they.
I agree with I agree with you, Jen, except the people who read The Guardian is not exactly the same cohort as the people who watch the History Channel.
Well,
there is that.
Maybe there's some selection going on there, and more people would watch the History Channel if it offered better programming.
Right. Well, this is what we pine for, and all we have to do is convince the History Channel of the truth of that.
I will offer myself as a fucking head if they need it. I'll do it, but we just need the right documentaries and programs. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've got horror stories to share with you some other time that might convince you that might not work out. But you never know.
Well, this is a point. I mean, and I want to ask you guys, like, how do you evaluate when somebody comes to you and says, I want to do a show? How do you evaluate whether they're going to present you what you're saying or not? It's always a conundrum. I mean, I know how to do that, really. CBC I knew was legitimate, so I was like, yes, but
Well, I had a producer approach me and flat out said they were doing a show about the lost continent of Atlantis, and it sounded great. They were really interested. They had read the chapter in my book, and on and on and on. And then the last thing they said before we were going to talk again and got some of the logistics taken care of was that, oh, by the way, we need you to say that Atlantis was a real place. And this was after a lengthy conversation of, between the producer, the assistant producer, and me about Plato and what the source of the story was and the lack of any evidence. They were all that was all great, but I had to say that Atlantis was real, and that went back and forth a number of times. They simply could not understand why I wouldn't say something that I didn't believe true. It was kind of astonishing, and well, there's a long story that we don't need to get into there, but I mean, ultimately, this is not going to get any better until we control we have at least more control over what gets put on cable. And we need the SAAs and the Society for Physical Anthropology. We have to get together. We have to buy our own damn channel and make our own damn programming. And that's ultimately the best way for us to get the word out.
Some of the larger associations do have the ability to put together a show that could compete. I mean, I feel like, well, they've certainly got the talent pool, and I know it costs money, but they're the groups that are going to be the most equipped to spend the kind of money that's going to be required, But I don't know, maybe we'll see it after the next SAAs. Maybe we'll see the Archaeology
public
channel.
Outreach and where the dollars go.
But Jennifer,
yeah.
thank you.
Can we talk about one other thing?
Oh, sure. No, go ahead.
Yeah. And this is related, but the presentation of results circumventing peer review is kind of troubling to me. Which, this document presented a whole bunch of, presented genetic results, like I ranted about earlier. The X2A, finding it is not a surprise and is not evidence of European ancestry, and that would not have passed peer review. I can tell you that for sure if they had presented like that. But how about the archaeology? I mean, I know they took them to France, which I didn't get to go, but they took them to France. And
you're really bitter about that, aren't you?
A little bit, yeah. I would love to go to France. Now, I think at that point I was too pregnant to fly, so I couldn't have gone anyway. But they took them to France, and they took them into some caves, and they found, some really cool cave paintings. And if I recall correctly, their evidence for the Solutreans being a seafaring people was that they found a fish picture and some deer. Is that right?
The fish was actually salmon, which means it could have been in a river. That's not necessarily
okay.
But they had the great. There was in Kosker Cave. I think it's Kosker. There's an image of a great auk, a now extinct large bird. And see, the thing that was really interesting about that, and again, it's how they make TV shows, is a single image of an auk in a single cave in France becomes gigantic populations of auks living on the sea ice. And that was the grocery store. They even used the term grocery store for the Solutreans that convinced them that they should go west, right? Yeah, go west, young Solutrean, go west. So it's taking a tiny little piece of art and expanding beyond all recognition and using that as evidence that they were a seafaring people and that there was all of these resources on the ice bridge.
They fell into the same trap that.
Sorry, go ahead.
They fell into the same trap that a lot of the shows that we critique did as well. They just told us that was a picture of a great auk, and they just told us that was a picture of a salmon. And I don't know if they ever showed the deer etching, but they just told us it was an etching of a deer. I don't feel like they gave us any explanation as to why we should believe that. Obviously it was a fish, but it could have been a pike. It could have been trout.
More to the point. Yeah, more to the point. And these studies have been done. Are there bones of either great auks or bones of salmon or whatever in archaeological context that are identified as Solutrean sites? It's one thing to put an animal cave wall, whatever it is. It's another thing to assume that means that people were actually hunting and eating those animals, because there are plenty of animals you see on cave walls that were not eaten. They're cave lions. They didn't eat those. There are woolly rhinoceroses. I don't think there's any evidence of woolly rhinoceros being hunted. So there are lots of reasons to put an image on a cave wall until you've got the bones in hearths or in fireplaces dating to the Solutrean. You don't know that they were eating those, that they were collecting those resources.
Yeah, and my point, I guess, for bringing all this up.
No, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. My point was, I brought all this up just to say, would this have passed review in Journal of Archaeological Science or some other archaeology journal as evidence for Solutreans being seafaring people?
Not without some data.
The peer review review that we've got here is that Bruce Bradley is, again, highly respected as a lithic analyst, and his stuff has been published in the journal World Archaeology, I think is the name of the journal, and that went through peer review. That doesn't mean everybody agreed with what he said, but they said, all right, this is an interesting hypothesis, an interesting take on comparing things. Okay, let's discuss. So it's worthy of consideration. So I think that's the case.
I think that's an important point to make, though, is that peer review doesn't necessarily make something factually true. It just says that the work has been done. There's enough presented here for us to discuss this seriously, and we should, as a community, either add this to our theory or discuss it as a group. Peer review, for our listeners, peer review doesn't make something true. It just means other professionals have looked at it and seen merit. But what Jennifer asked is if the stuff presented as the show presented it, would that have passed muster? And no, there's no data, there's no explanation for where this analysis came from. And I'm not saying that the work has never been done. I'm saying the show did not present that. Obviously, Bradley and Stanford are both scientists. They've been published. They understand how peer review works. They know what they're supposed to put together in order to get something through a journal. But just going to a cave and looking up and being like, oh, there's a picture that could be a great arc, and I'm just going to say that it is because you can't prove me otherwise, and then suddenly we're off on this tangent about billions of birds on ice rafts. No, that would not have made it through peer review.
Right. More than likely not. And, peer-reviewed articles that are peer-reviewed journals, fairly regularly, there are rejoinders published in the next issue where somebody says, no, you know what? These guys are full of shit. And this is why. And then there are responses to rejoinders. But the deal there is there's enough evidence presented to at least initiate a conversation, as opposed to that's just a just so story. That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And I'm afraid documentaries are really just so stories. And, so I want to caution people not to, it looks impressive, but, it needs to be rigorously tested.
Right. Exactly. But again, that requires reading.
Right. Jennifer, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Absolutely.
I usually do a final thoughts thing, but I think we kind of did that. And it was great to have you last time. It's great to have you this time.
I have a final thought.
Okay, go ahead.
I want, at least the last thing I'm going to say is a quote. This is word for word from the documentary. Oh, no. Ready? Archaeologists are skeptical of any theory that can't be backed by concrete proof. Well, there you go. That's why we don't accept the hypothesis.
Well said. Thank you guys so much for having on. I really appreciate the chance to.
It's been a pleasure, Jen. Real pleasure.
Awesome.
Houses and Romans. Human evolution makes us not.
Thanks for listening to the Archaeological Fantasies podcast. You can find links to the items mentioned on the show at our website at www.archpodnet.com/archifantasies. Like and subscribe on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. Be sure to share this episode with your friends on social media. Follow Sarah's Archifantasies blog at www.archifantasies.com. You'll also find the show on Tumblr, Twitter, and Facebook, also at Archifantasies. Music was provided by Archaeosoup at Archaeosoup Productions. Thanks again for listening.
We don't do dinosaurs!
This show is produced by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle in Reno, Nevada at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
See? Are you happy? Do you get it now? Do you get it?